I'm Eliza Sherman, and I'm the CEO of Ellementa, and this is the Women's Wellness Virtual Happening. I'm not calling them webinars right now because we're not using slides. They're not super formal. These are great, energetic conversations with experts and authors, interesting women. I'm excited to get started, but first I want to let you know about a few of the things coming up. So if you're watching this live or anytime before the middle of June, then on May 31st, it is Relationship Rewards. I'm having a friend, Roxanne Darling, coming on talking about how to avoid the blame game. I don't know about you, but the sheltering at home can be very challenging on relationships. So I can't wait to hear what Roxanne has to say. Then on June 3rd, we have Katie Stem from Peak Extracts talking about her experience with cannabis for Crohn's disease. So if you are suffering from anything intestinal, you may or may not know that cannabis can be helpful to intestinal issues. So next up, show and tell for just a quick moment, Peak Extracts. That we're going to be giving away some of these Peak Extract products. These are topicals, pain relief topicals, very terpene, full spectrum, terpene rich. Just letting you know what's coming up. That's June 3rd. And on June 7th, we have Melody Moisey, the author of this gorgeous book, The Roomy Prescriptions. Love, love, love this book. So this is part of our book club series. Actually, we are now doing book club like anytime we have an author. So, but we're going to meet Melody talking about mental health issues and poetry. So imagine that. Let's see. The last one I was going to mention is June 10th. Your life depends on this easy workout. So your life depends on this easy workout with Laura Putnam. She does a lot of corporate training and fitness. So I can't wait to hear what she has to say, because I know I have to move more. You probably have to move around more, especially when we're just sitting around doing our work on our computer. Okay, that's all of the preview I have for you at the moment. Oh, I do want to just do one more quick little plug since we're into the whole show and tell thing at the moment. I'm not sure if you can see, it's a very reflective. I'm taking this at the moment. It's called MenoChill. It is a CBD product, but it really is a probiotic and prebiotic for women in menopause or approaching menopause. And I have to say, I know that probiotics and prebiotics are really good for you. And it seems to be quite helpful. So I'm going to do a review later about it, but I just wanted to mention it since we've got a lot of women here right now paying attention. If you're of a certain age, approaching menopause, you definitely want to try that. And by the way, none of these are paid sponsors. We do have paid sponsorship that we have on occasion, but these are all just personal recommendations and upcoming experts. So without further ado, we've got Mary Jane Gibson on board. She is an actress. She's a podcast co-host. She has multiple talents. And I just learned that she worked on a fishing boat in Alaska for 4 years. So Mary Jane, hi, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I work in cannabis as a career. I transitioned from working as an actor in New York to writing about cannabis full-time when I took a job at High Times magazine. I then moved to Los Angeles to continue working for High Times in 2016, and I left there a couple of years ago, and now I freelance for several outlets, and I cover cannabis culture for Rolling Stone, Green Entrepreneur, other outlets like Leafly and Weed Maps, and I also co-host Weed Grub, which is my podcast with comedian Mike Glazer, and we love food and we love cannabis, and we use those as the cornerstones for conversations about absolutely everything under the sun. And we talk to people who are cannabis users and in the cannabis industry, and also people who are not necessarily in that world and are just interested in having fun conversations.
Well, if on the topic of weed and grub, I wanted to find out from you, what are some of the most interesting interviews you've done, particularly of women? And I like to showcase women. If you have interesting men too, that's totally fine. But I like to showcase women because there are so many fewer. Is that even how to say it? There's a dearth of platforms for us that are really celebrating what women are doing. I mean, there's more and more of them, but I do find that we mostly hear of the men who are in this industry. We are mostly hearing about, or we're mostly seeing products on the shelf that are either not geared toward, men or women, or more geared toward the guy. So let's talk a little bit about some of your most interesting guests, and we'll work our way into women's roles in the industry, culture, etc.
Absolutely. Some of the women that I've interviewed are my favorite interviews for the podcast. Just yesterday, in fact, we spoke to Alia Volz, who wrote a book called Home Baked: My Mom, Marijuana, and the Stoning of San Francisco. I actually have a copy here.
Oh, great. Oh,
it's a fantastic book. And she writes about her childhood growing up as the daughter of a woman who was baking brownies for thousands of people every week in San Francisco. And
but wait, what was
not Brownie Mary. She was sort of a contemporary of Brownie Mary at the same time in the 70s and 80s in San Francisco. So Alia was a fantastic interview, a really fascinating overview of the last 40 years of cannabis culture and how it's changed from the 70s in San Francisco to now. I also really loved speaking with Amy Margolis, who is the head of a program called The Initiative, which is aimed at creating space for female entrepreneurs in the cannabis space and giving them the tools that they need to succeed, bringing them all the way through a program where it finishes with them pitching to investors and supporting them along the way. And Amy is a lawyer who founded the Oregon Cannabis Association. So she is just on the ground in Oregon doing the work to make space for women in the industry and make sure that they have the tools that they need to succeed, which is incredible.
She is doing great work. She is, and some friends of ours from Tokativity, I think, went through her program, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Samantha and yes, absolutely. And then just on a personal note, I love speaking with comedians like Mary Sohn, who is on a wonderful show called Work in Progress that's set in Chicago. And she was just like the most fun to come on and play and talk about her work in the television industry and, how she sees the cannabis industry in Los Angeles from an entertainment perspective. I've spoken with a lot of fascinating people. Corey Thomas as well, if you want to check out the Weed and Grub episode with Corey. She talks about being in her third decade of cannabis as the daughter of growers and now the CEO of her own company called Honeypot. I don't know if you've ever spoken with Corey, but she's fascinating.
No, but I have heard of Honeypot. Yeah, okay. It's amazing how women have been present throughout history in relation to cannabis. We were talking just right before we got started. I mentioned that in my book that I co-wrote with Dr. June Chin, Cannabis and CBD for Health and Wellness is the title. We spent a whole chapter talking about the timeline of cannabis used as medicine. And it was fascinating to find that women played such an integral role with the plant, which, if you think about it, isn't as surprising because we have been healers and herbalists and midwives through the centuries. And to be using a plant as medicine makes total sense. Do you have any favorite anecdote from history, anytime, ancient or just recent history, about women in cannabis that you find interesting?
Oh boy.
I'm putting you on the spot now. Like, history lesson.
Anecdote. Well, I think one of the things that, really struck me was I interviewed Melissa Etheridge when I was with High Times, and she spoke about discovering cannabis as medicine when she was going through chemotherapy for breast cancer. And she had never been a cannabis user, and she discovered it as medicine because it was recommended to her by David Crosby, who said, you've got to try this. It's going to be great. It's going to help you with your symptoms. It's going to encourage your appetite. It's going to alleviate some of the pain. And she discovered it as medicine and now is a huge advocate for it and has actually launched, I think, a line of cannabis-infused wines here in California.
I read about that a while ago, but I haven't heard a whole lot about it.
I think there are a lot of regulations and
it's really hard.
Bumps on the road to getting any product in California launched in cannabis. But I think that really struck me because she was, not a cannabis user. She came to cannabis later in life in her 50s as medicine. And I think that's truly been my experience in the industry. I entered writing about cannabis culture from a recreational perspective as someone who just, loved going to the woods and running around with friends and, enjoying a joint in that way. And then, really sort of discovered the medical side of things. And so that's definitely been, my way to talk a bit to a lot of people like my parents about my career in weed is that it is this beneficial plant, especially with my mom, who's 81 now and who I think when I was a teenager was terrified that I was going to go off the rails somehow if I ever got a hold of cannabis. And now, she'll eat a CBD gummy and feel a little relaxed, and it's been great.
Which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. Talking about culture and talking about the changes that have happened over the decades, can you take us back in time a little bit to, as far back as you'd like to go, about women and cannabis? I mean, we've been there. We were talking just a moment ago about Brownie Mary and her contemporaries, women who were baking to bring cannabis medicine to people who needed it. Mm-hmm. Can you take us through a little bit of a timeline of some of the things that you know of in terms of our roles as women and how they've changed, some observations too?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start with the beginning of the drug war, which stigmatized cannabis use in the United States after it had been in use as a medicine. As you say, it was available in pharmaceuticals. Cannabis tincture was, readily available to treat headaches and insomnia and appetite and all that sort of thing. And then the drug war, the origins of the drug war really started actually here in California and in the southern parts of the US when Mexican immigrants came across the border and the local authorities were looking for ways to sort of police and control them. And cannabis was one of them, their cannabis use, and they renamed it marijuana. And then they used marijuana laws to target these communities of color, and that gradually worked its way up to federal law. And the Marijuana Tax Act, which was enacted in, I think, 1927, really was the beginning of criminalizing cannabis in order to, again, demonize people of color and say that it would, force you to listen to jazz and it would make a black man look at a white woman, all this kind of.
Well, it was saying that it was going to trigger violence between violent acts as well. And yeah. So a lot of propaganda was spread.
Yeah. I mean, reefer madness, all of that sort of stuff. It was absolute propaganda with no basis in truth and just a means to demonize and control populations. And it was extraordinarily successful. The fact that, people are still terrified of a plant.
I know, beautiful plant you got back there.
It's a plant that just grows is indicative of how easy it is to tap into people's fears and then use that to control them. And people who were the architects of the drug war, there was an aide of Nixon's who went on the record to say, oh, absolutely, it was just a way for us to target and police communities of color and communities like the hippie movement, the anti-war movement, who were using cannabis, and we could use the weed to bust them and take them down. So the drug war was invented, just about 100 years ago, and has been extremely, extremely successful in making people really scared of this plant and stigmatizing it. And so especially women, I think, in the home suffered because they weren't able to be open about their use because they could lose their children. Mm. They could,
Well, that still is happening today.
Yeah. Yeah. It endangers, your entire family. So they had to be incredibly quiet about their cannabis use if they were using it. And if they, were found with it, they, suffered incredibly. And, families were lost, and there's still people obviously suffering. So as you say, so that's sort of the bigger picture that I always try to talk about, is that, there's been 100 years of incredibly successful government-based, fear-driven propaganda about a plant that is beneficial, no matter how you choose to use it. If you choose to use it to unwind at the end of the day, like I do, that's great. If you choose to use it medicinally, it's just truly an incredible plant that works for a lot of people. And if it doesn't work for you, I also understand that. I have friends who talk about, their attempts to find something that works for them, and they haven't found any way of ingesting cannabis that makes them, understand the benefits of it. But then I say, well, try suppository, or try topical, or, try a low dose edible. There are all sorts of ways to interact with the benefits of the plant.
Well, how has the way that women are choosing to use the plant changing over time? I would guess that a lot of it has to do with the industry maturing and new products coming on board. Mm-hmm. But from just people you've interviewed, things you've observed, what are women gravitating toward in terms of product?
Well, I think, speaking to Alia Volt about her mom making these brownies in San Francisco in the 70s and 80s, the edibles market was a really great way for women to stay sort of underground with their consumption for a long time. You wouldn't smell like smoke. You could, enjoy it, like keep a brownie in your bag and, take a bite at work when your boss was being a jerk. So I think edibles, women have always leaned towards edibles as a very stealthy and discreet way to ingest cannabis. I also was just reading on Headset, which is an analytics company out of Seattle, that women in the data, it shows that women buy more tinctures, topicals, edibles, and vape pens than men, who buy more concentrates. And I think that may have to do with women being more interested in low dosing and microdosing as a daily sort of wellness routine, as opposed to really kind of going for it, like
getting super high,
which also, I have no judgment or shame about. I have
exactly
a lot of friends who use them medicinally at very, very high doses, and they have a tolerance that requires 1,000 milligrams of THC. So it's just what works for you. But I think that the low dose edibles market, the topicals market, tinctures and suppositories, that sort of thing, we're seeing a trend for more women consumers for those particular types of cannabis products. And especially because they're discreet.
Well, right. So flower, I'm always curious about flower. I also have, we work with some partners who are always curious about what women think of cannabis flower. And you even made a comment, at the end of the day, to relax, you might smoke a joint. I think I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing, and this could be wrong, and it could be generalization. My world might be very small, but it seems to me that younger women are embracing flower a lot, and more mature, sort of my age kind of women are really looking at the tinctures, the edibles. And then I find that women who are brand new to cannabis and just dipping their toe in that proverbial water will start with that topical. And kind of a funny true story, confession, I first tried a CBD topical, not even any THC at all, but a CBD topical about 4 years ago. I received it for free at a conference. I was afraid. I actually thought it would absorb into my skin and get me high, which I didn't want to be, because I was still really entrenched in the stigma, even as I was trying to get into this industry. And it was a very visceral reaction. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get high, especially because I was putting it on the arthritis on my neck. And I'm like, it's so close to my brain. It's going to sink in. There is that fear and that misunderstanding. And so I did find a lot I do find a lot of women who are just getting started will start with that topical. But what about flower? I mean, what are you seeing? Do you see any sort of trends, or have you read or heard about anything about women and flower versus men?
Well, I think you're right that a lot of younger women are really interested in flower. I think there's this amazing movement now the cannabis has, coming out of the shadows and the stigma is lessening for cannabis use, that younger women, I have a lot of friends in their 20s and 30s who just smoke flower for, to relax, and also for endometriosis or period pain or that sort of thing. There's no stigma around it. There's no shame. They, are open about their cannabis use with their parents, and it's fantastic. And there's a really great magazine called Broccoli. I don't know if you've seen it. I brought a show and tell.
I know about Broccoli, and I've never actually seen an issue. And
it's beautiful, and it's designed for, like sort of young millennial women. It's, the art design is beautiful. The stories are fantastic. And it's really about celebrating the plant and the flower. And it's not, trying to sort of say that topicals or tinctures are the way to go or anything. It's really, it's sort of like cannabis culture for young women. I mean, for all women, but it's specifically, I think, made and put out for women in their 20s and 30s. And it's fantastic. So I think that the stigma has lessened for younger women to use flower, and that women who are in their 40s and 50s still suffer from that stigma. The smell makes them nervous because they think they're going to get busted, so there's that sort of like weird lizard brain part of us that's like, you smell it and you think crime, which is crazy that it's been that successful, because you're truly just smelling a burning plant that to me smells delicious.
It smells fantastic. But also the other thing I wanted to mention about flower is, as the industry matures, it's coming out into the open. It's almost like an artisanal growing, and sort of the nuances of the plant, and a greater awareness of terpenes, a greater awareness of all the cannabinoids. It's turning into almost, I kept on saying early on, this is sort of reminding me of the wine industry, because I had been working in the wine industry for a number of years. And I'm like, this could really turn into some kind of, the idea of tastings, the idea of pairings. That's very much like the wine industry. And this plant has so many subtleties and complexities, from smell to taste to effect, that I can see it from the flower, the natural state, being a really interesting place to delve into your cannabis experience.
Absolutely. I highly encourage everyone, if you're not already following Rachel Birkins on Instagram, her handle is @SmokeSipSavor. And Rachel is such an incredible standard bearer for exactly what you're talking about, because first off, she's a mom. She's open about her cannabis use as a chef and as an advocate for cannabis use for all reasons. And she partners with her brother, Chef Holden Jagger, in an enterprise called Altered Plates. And they really talk a lot about the profiles of the plant as an element of cuisine, not trying to mask the smell, but actually using all of the terpenes. And they talk a lot about, the limonene and linalool and all that sort of stuff as elements of a dish. And Chef Jagger actually went to the James Beard House in New York to do a demo for James Beard award-winning chefs about terpenes. So I think there is this new era in edibles and cannabis where people are, thinking about the plant in the way that it should be thought of, as this incredibly complex plant with incredible flavor profiles that are, really worth paying attention to. And, you don't need to just kind of try and put it into a brownie and choke it down, but you can, create these wild dishes. And, another thing that's happening is people are growing their own. I mean, you can, here in California, have your own plant, and you can get a high CBD strain, for instance, if you are, wanting to just experiment with the flavor profiles without, getting, knocked for a loop by something that's really high THC. I'm seeing Rachel's last name.
How do you spell? I'll type it. How do you spell it?
Rachel Birkins, Burkons, and her handle is @SmokeSipSavor. And she's wonderful. Her Instagram profile, she says she's a bong vivant.
Bon vivant. I love it. I love it. That's a great recommendation. I wrote it down myself because I wanted to check that out. And I think, as we're talking about women in cannabis, one of the things I wanted to explore with you is what women are bringing to the cannabis industry, and what women are bringing to the development of new products. I know you have one product that you were going to show, which to me is very illustrative of where we as women are coming from when we come to this industry, which up until very recently was extremely male dominated. And now so many women have gotten involved. And I believe we're making very positive change to the industry because of our experiences and our needs and our sensibilities and our desires to create something bigger than ourselves that helps others, which I find to be quite a unifying thread in so many of the women I've interviewed. So what have you observed in terms of what women bring to the cannabis industry?
Well, one of my favorite things about women in the cannabis industry right now is that we're sort of getting to define our own roles in the industry and define what the future looks like, because it is a brand new industry. And so instead of fighting for a seat at the table, we are building the table and we can design our own seats. And it's pretty great to think that, you know, we really do have that opportunity. And of course, we're having to push back against the usual forces of, you know, honestly, like wealthy white older men coming in from Wall Street and venture capitalism and saying this is how it should be. And I think that, you know, those conversations obviously have to be had, because we do need big money and we do need investors in order to bring the whole thing online in a legal market. But we also don't have to allow them to dictate the terms of our roles in the industry. And so there are so many leaders like Corey Thomas with Honeypot, for instance, is the one that always comes to mind for me, because she's her third decade into this industry. She grew up as the child of growers and she knows what's happening. And she also knows that the ones who will be standing at the end of this all are truly the ones who are dedicated to what the plant is about, and not profit, not cannabis as a commodity, but cannabis as something that can change society. That it, you know, cannabis might actually be the way out of some of the trauma of the pandemic that we're experiencing. Economically, it might be an engine to help heal communities from COVID-19. So it was just, you know, declared an essential because it truly is. And even though the federal government hasn't recognized that, certainly state governments more and more, 30 plus, have recognized that. So I think that women, you know, getting to decide what the industry looks like is one of the things that excites me the most. Younger women coming up, women of color who are coming out of underserved communities, who are able to, you know, dictate what the plant should give back to their community is really exciting. And I think I got off topic because I can't remember the beginning of the question.
I was queuing you up to show some of the product that you have created by women.
Right. So no, but the female entrepreneurs in the space. Thank you so much. So yeah, I did bring a show and tell, because some of the products that I am really excited about are made by women. Do you know about Quim?
Yeah, yes, of course. But share with everybody.
So Quim is a female-founded and owned company that makes cannabis topicals for intimate oils for your vagina. And
I think their website is like for people with vaginas.
It's for humans with vaginas and humans without vaginas who love vaginas.
Who love vaginas. There you go. Yeah.
So it's for everyone. And they make a bunch of different products. They have one called Smooth Operator that I really like. It's an intimate oil. And they have one that's just an everyday intimate oil that's not necessarily for sex. It's just for, you know, all the time, called Happy Clam, that I love. So I think Quim are doing wonderful things. And their CEO, Kayo Nystrom, is a wonderful speaker and advocate for the plant. She's just fantastic. So I love Quim. I also love Hello Again. And you were saying that, you know...
well, we had them on as guests. I just spoke to them recently. And
so you might know more about them than I do, because I was just given these as something to try. They're suppositories for peri and menopausal women.
Yes. So some are, I think there's the everyday version, which is for sort of daily supplemental health. And then there's a sleep aid one as well. So you have to buy them at a dispensary, a licensed dispensary, because they do have THC and specially formulated for women's bodies. So they are vaginal suppositories. And I have to say, it was part of the conversation was about vaginal suppositories and how not every woman has used one before. It's not until you get to a certain age with certain ailments that you might encounter it. It's not the most common way that we take in our medicine in this modern age. It was a very common way, decades and centuries ago. But, you know, there's all kinds of reasons for us not being as comfortable with it, but it can be an extremely effective way of taking in your cannabis or your CBD.
I use the Foria suppositories for pelvic pain when I have my period. And I know that they've done a great job in alleviating pain for a friend of mine who has endometriosis, who uses cannabis specifically to relieve the pain associated with that. I use it when I'm on my cycle. I have a couple of days of pretty severe cramps, and it really helps. It's pretty incredible. And they're not psychoactive. So you feel relief locally because it increases the blood flow in your pelvis, but it doesn't actually get you high.
Right. And I've been trying to figure out exactly why that is, because in a sense, so when you think about absorbing into your bloodstream, this is going back to the topicals thing. The topicals will sit on the layer, the first few layers of your skin, the surface of your skin, with some kind of additional ingredient. It can then penetrate more deeply. So think of a patch, how a patch can actually break the blood-brain barrier and go into your skin. So anything that goes into your nose, your mouth, under your tongue will also absorb and bypass the liver, just absorb into your bloodstream. So the vaginal canal is like mucous membranes, and so it can absorb into the bloodstream. I was always asking, but why don't you get high then? Can't you get high? And I think depending on the concentrations and depending on your sensitivity, some women can maybe feel a lot more relaxed, but that it does, because of the location and where it goes, it sort of stays in your lower region in a lot of ways.
I will say, anecdotally, I did experience one night where I had plans and I put in a suppository and then I canceled my plans because I was like, no, I'm just too relaxed to go anymore. So it did change my behavior in that sense, but only in the sense that I had a wonderful nap on my couch instead of going to meet a friend. So.
Yeah, so you can never say definitively, it will do this, it will not do that, because everybody is different. Each of our bodies are different. Our endocannabinoid systems are different. So the needs and what we respond to. I'm super, super, super sensitive. So when people talk about microdose, and you mentioned microdosing before, and that's one thing that's very hard to do with flower is microdosing, unless you're using a really calibrated flower vape pen, for example. And it's still kind of hard to microdose. But my microdose, which is fully effective, is maybe 2.5 milligrams. For somebody else's might be 25.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why there are these great, I was going to show the Satori mints, which I love because they are.
Oh, yeah, Satori. Yeah.
Satori, which are currently headed up by a colleague of mine from High Times, Elise McDonough, who is another wonderful follow. Do you know Elise?
I do. She interviewed us on our book tour. Yeah, she's great.
She's fantastic. Her Instagram handle is @CannabisEdibles420, and she's just an amazing follow, mouth-watering pictures. She's been in the cannabis industry for a very long time. She's a cookbook author, and she's now the brand manager for Satori. And they make all sorts of wonderful low-dose edibles, and these are 2 milligrams of THC per mint, which is perfect. So for me, that's nature's Xanax. That's just enough to take the stress out of my day. I can have one in the morning. I'm not a wake and baker so much because I can't be as effective as I'd like to be with, meetings and writing and the things that I have to do during the day. But a 2 milligram mint is enough with my morning coffee to just, make me feel a little less stressed out by this world that we're all living in.
This world that we are. I have to then throw in a little plug for Highland Pantry. Have you heard of their mints?
No.
So it's 3 different levels: mini, midi, and more. And I want to say, I always get numbers wrong, so pardon me if this is incorrect. It's sort of a 1-to-1, but it starts off at maybe a 3 milligram, then a 5 milligram, and then a little bit higher, a 9 milligram, something like that, where it's intervals, but really balance the CBD to THC. Tiny little delicious mints in adorable tins, and it was geared toward a mature woman. They called it for boomer babes.
I love that.
And it's a wonderful company. They've got great products available only in California. Again, if it's THC, you've got to get it at a dispensary, and often it's just a regionally based, a single state based. There are a couple of companies that you can get in several states, like Kiva Confections, you can get in California and in Illinois. I believe, what are some of the other ones? Foria, you can get, I believe, in Colorado and California. But there usually aren't a lot of brands out there that you could get across all of
Yeah,
the
that's the crazy thing about this marijuana state by state legalization is that they can't cross state lines. So it's pretty cool actually, because you get to be a weed tourist when you go to a new state and you get to try all of their new
all the new
products and the
things.
flower. I love going to Oregon and trying the flower in Oregon. It's incredible because of course they grow the best, some of the most beautiful wines in Oregon. They're also growing some of the best biodynamic, gorgeous, delicious cannabis. And some of the growers there, a couple of my favorite growers are women actually. There's a wonderful grower, Julia at Sugar Top Buttery in Oregon, who's a cohort with the initiative right now.
Wow.
And there's another farm called Oso Verde that's run by Britt and Kendra. They came out of the Humboldt growing scene, the underground growing scene, and now they have the legal grow in Oregon. They're incredible. They have all this institutional knowledge that they're bringing to bear. And they just founded a company called Mendy with Megan and Rachel Rapino.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I know Mendy, absolutely. Okay,
Yeah. That's just tons of young women coming up doing cool stuff in the business, and older women who are coming out of the shadows making cool things like these folks, and and then OGs like Corey Thomas who are leading the charge and leading the way for what cannabis should look like and what she believes to, and she's sticking to her guns, and it's just so inspirational to watch her continue to stand up to these, big business places like MedMen or, other places that are trying to dictate what the cannabis industry should look like. And we're seeing that, they're not having that much success. So,
well, yeah, and they're in a lot of trouble right now. Speaking of MedMen, and to be frank, and I don't really like to sort of badmouth anybody, but one of my least pleasant experiences going into a cannabis dispensary was there at one of their shops. Here I came into it with some knowledge, and I was kind of talked down to. And I think that's a lot of women are intimidated about going into dispensaries and making purchases because they are, they're not understood. This is another experience I had at a dispensary when I went in very, very specifically looking for something for my symptoms of menopause, particularly insomnia, but for menopause, which is a whole different type of insomnia than just simple stressful insomnia or something else. So I was, oh my gosh, I ended up with a young guy, and I was like, okay, I'll just tell him because, this is his job. I said, I'm in menopause. I have insomnia. I'm looking for something to help me sleep. And he leads me over and he shows me something. He goes, I know exactly what you need. This will get you really effed up. It's like, what did you just say to me? What did you just say to me? If I wasn't in the industry and if this was my first time at a dispensary, I would have been just mortified. But that is sometimes what women encounter still at various dispensaries. I really love the women-owned dispensaries or the dispensaries that are actually run by men with that idea of creating a welcoming space for everyone, so they feel comfortable, so that they feel empowered, that they feel educated. But I do find that those that are owned or run by women have a different sensibility, a certain comfort level, because we know what it's like to walk into a space and go, oh my God, I don't feel safe, or oh my gosh, this is not for me.
Mm-hmm. I think that's also, one of the best reasons to shop local and not go to these big chains, and go to support your local dispensary that may have, been a medical marijuana dispensary and has now come into the adult use market, or maybe you have a medical card and you can still, find a medical dispensary. Like I have a few here in West Hollywood that I love to support because they're just tiny shops that are, really about interacting with patients and customers one-on-one in a way that will, hopefully help them be return and repeat customers. And, I did have that experience as well when I went to a big new chain that's here in my neighborhood. And I had a very enthusiastic young gal who said her name was Hazy, take me around the dispensary, and she was telling me about all of the products, but she was just talking about brands. And when I started asking her about, any of the sort of information that you really want, like cannabinoid profiles or how it's
Terpenes.
grown or any of that kind of stuff, she was total crickets. And it was so interesting to sort of realize that, like, yeah, of course, there's that is happening in the industry as well. As these bigger shops are opening up, they're hiring people who look great and might not have the knowledge. So it's really, this strange world where you have to arm yourself with all of the knowledge that you need in order to ask the right questions. It's like buying a car, you've got to sort of like do your research before you go in and then stand your ground and say, no, I know what I want, or I know what my friend said I should buy. And that's what I'm here for. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to go through the chat for a moment because I did see a couple of questions. One is, how did you get involved with High Times? Were you approached by them or did you go to them? How did that come about? And when was that, like in your career?
I moved to New York City in 2003 from Seattle, so I went to theater school in Montreal and I was acting full-time. I had moved to Seattle. I was born in the States, so I wanted to sort of come back to the States from Canada to sort of experience what it was like down here. And I'd been acting in Seattle, and then I moved to New York, and I was writing and performing in New York, and I met the managing editor of High Times at the time at a party, and we hit it off and became friends. And the whole staff of High Times at that time was a really tight-knit group of friends who vacationed together. They did everything together, and they invited me to go on a Catskills weekend retreat with them. And we ran around in the woods and we had a great time. And it was the first time I ever saw a volcano vaporizer bag. And they just introduced me to this whole wild culture that they had, which at the time was totally underground. Cannabis was only, Prop 215 in California was really the only legal cannabis medical program in the country at the time. So it was very underground. They all wrote under pen names. They would get blindfolded to go to grows. And it just was this sort of like renegade outlaw culture that I was fascinated by. So I became great friends with them. And then a few years later, I think it was 2007, the managing editor, who was a great friend, offered me some copy editing work, part-time copy editing work, because I was writing and performing as an actor and I needed to support myself on the side like you do in New York. So I started working as a copy editor, and then I worked my way up to writing articles for them, and that turned into a full-time editorial position. In 2014, they hired me as their full-time lifestyle editor.
Wow.
And then I took over the entertainment section and ultimately became the culture editor, which was sort of everything that wasn't growing or politics. So I got to do all the fun interviews and write about all of the intersections of cannabis with all parts of life that didn't have to do with either growing or the political beat.
You talked about some of the women that you have interviewed. Anyone else that you wanted to mention that you enjoyed interviewing?
Margaret Cho scared the daylights out of me.
Oh, wow.
She was so fun. She was the coolest. Oh my God. I was so intimidated because I had just taken the job. I tweeted at Margaret Cho, and said, would you be interested in being featured in High Times? And she got right back to me. And she said, absolutely. So I drove down to Atlantic City and interviewed her before her show at the Borgata. And she did a couple of bong rips and offered me, the same. And so I got really high and had an hour-long sort of existential crisis about, my life while Margaret Cho and I were hanging out. And it was just great because she was so brilliant and sharp and cool. And I think the thing is, when you meet a comedian who's at that level, you realize how fiery they are. And she just was so fascinating. So she was definitely one of my favorite interviews ever. She's great.
That is great. We've got a question from Emma. Any advice or resources you'd recommend for a young female looking to learn more about the industry and the plant?
Well, it depends on where you are, but no matter where you are in the country, I'd say join your local chapters of any advocacy group that you can. I always recommend that people join NORML, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and they have a chapter for women specifically, but just become a member of NORML and support what they're doing, because at a federal level, they are behind the legalization movement and have been since the 70s. They're amazing. So I would just say, get involved in local meetups. Toketivity is a wonderful community for women globally. You can join some of their meetups. They have fun afternoons where you get together with people and, like share.
They do some like art things too.
Yeah, I've had some fun crafting times with
Crafting,
them.
yeah,
And I get,
crafting.
they
They're
just,
wonderful. And well, Ellementa, the group that I founded, we haven't been meeting for a while, but we had about 60 cities across North America. Every month, women would be meeting in different cities. And that was one way of doing it. So we're just doing the virtual thing right now, maybe someday in the future,
yeah.
in person. There are a lot of women out there in the industry, also, I want to mention, who are just open to being mentors or answering questions about whether it be cultivation or product, and then listening to podcasts such as yours, Weed Grub, such as this is kind of a podcast-ish.
Yeah.
And I see April Pride is in the audience.
Oh, hi, April. Yeah,
So
April has a great podcast called How to Do the Pot.
How to Do the Pot, a modern woman's guide to legal cannabis, produced by Gina Delvac of Call Your Girlfriend. Call Your Girlfriend's a good podcast too.
Yeah, I love Call Your Girlfriend.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. When I was hoping to do a podcast early on, it was all labor of love. I have a website called hercannalife.com where we profile women in the cannabis industry. That's another resource too. You can read about what brought each woman to cannabis personally and professionally. So I was like, I'm going to do a podcast again because I am a professional podcaster. And April was my first interview. And then Megan Stone was my second interview. And I still have the raw footage, completely unedited from both of those interviews from about 3 years ago.
I can't wait to hear them.
I don't know if I mean, it's really outdated now, but
yeah,
maybe I can revisit that at some point. Lisette is saying, any advice for writing professionally about weed rather than coming off as just a stoner girl? I'm working on pitching a column for a community newspaper in Long Beach. Weed is recreationally legal in Long Beach, California. Yeah, what kind of advice would you give to Lisette?
Well, my advice, honestly, is to, speak about the things that need to be addressed. Obviously, if you enjoy cannabis and you consider yourself a stoner, I think there's, it's a great time to be proud about that and be open about your own cannabis consumption. But speaking about what's going on in your community is a good way to get started with writing professionally, learning about what's happening in the culture around you, as opposed to just writing about your own experience, because it's great to hear about people's experience with the plant, but it's, from a professional perspective, you want to write about the stories that are unfolding in your community and the world around you. So I would just say, maybe find someone who's in the industry and profile them and pitch that as a column for your local paper, or, read a book that's about the cannabis community and review that, something that's not necessarily first person, your own story. What do you think?
Yeah, I think exactly what you're talking about is spot on. The idea, so both of us are writers, and I'm a freelance writer for magazines and newspapers and websites, and I've written 12 books. So I feel like I've got a good perspective on it. And mostly it is when you're approaching a magazine or in this case, a community paper, get to know their audience. Look at everything else that's in that magazine and pinpoint the types of topics that would appeal to that audience. So if you're just looking for a platform for yourself and your own voice, that's one thing. That's one way of approaching. And it's a little bit harder unless you have sort of established an identity that's clear and have a big platform that is attractive to a publication. But really what they're looking for is to serve their audience and to sell ads. So what can you do to attract the right kind of audience to them, to serve the audience they have? I mean, when you're thinking of freelance writing, this is a business proposition. It'll lead to building your profile, your personal profile and your image.
And I think that, right now, there are so many ways to express your own views on cannabis. You can use, obviously, social media, and you can write on Tumblr and Medium and all that sort of stuff. But if you're pitching a magazine, I know, for instance, at Rolling Stone, they really ask you to keep yourself out of your writing. That's very occasionally, like, I'll put myself in if I'm, like I wrote about going to the first cannabis cafe in West Hollywood, and I had to write about that from my own perspective and experience. But for the most part, if I'm writing about anything, I'm not using I in the story. Of course, that as a writer, it's like you just take yourself out and look at it and report that. So I'd say that would be the way to get started.
Yeah, and the last thing is, go to the publications where you would like to be writing and ask them what they need. And in fact, I have a steady writing gig for an Alaska newspaper and an Alaska magazine. One is the Alaska Cannabis. Yeah, I'm based in Alaska, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know. And that is about the Alaska statewide industry, cannabis industry, and then Alaska Pulse, just about health and wellness throughout the state of Alaska. I constantly go back to my editor because I want as many writing jobs as I can get right now. And what do you need? What is a topic that you want covered that hasn't been filled yet? What can I do for you? How can I, help you make your job? How can I make your job easier? And he keeps me really busy.
I will say I carved out my beat at High Times by covering, because at the time High Times was really a homegrown magazine that was a lot of cultivation articles and a lot of news articles. And I didn't see, the LGBTQ community being covered. I didn't see women in cannabis being covered. I didn't see the fringe art scene being covered. I didn't see a lot of coverage of communities of color. And so I carved out my beat by writing about the things that I really wanted to write about that I saw were underrepresented. And that, led to more and more work.
That's fantastic. That's a great perspective as well. All right. So we gave lots of advice. Really good advice. Let us know how it goes.
Yes,
so
please.
Here's another question. How has weed influenced your art?
Oh boy, how has it not? I encountered cannabis when I was in Newfoundland in the 80s as a teenager. And I was kind of involved in the skateboard and punk rock scene as a teenager. I hung out with all of the punk rock bands and they all smoked hash. And so, it was kind of like a part of my life from when I was about 13 or 14. And I then at theater school didn't smoke a lot, but was definitely always interested in the elevation of consciousness that happens with cannabis use and how it can unlock your creativity, or, if you get stuck in a corner, it can sort of unwedge you and start the flow again, or, it can sort of it can stop you from obsessing about a certain idea if you're trying to find your way into something. As David Crosby, when I interviewed David Crosby for Weed Grub, I asked him, about how he used cannabis for creativity. And he said he always wrote high. He said, everything you hear me perform, I wrote high. I don't perform high. But every song you'll hear that I've written, it was written on weed. And so, I think that's, I don't perform when I'm stoned. I can't get on stage even if I've had a sip of wine, but I have used it to write, to unlock myself if I've gotten stuck. I've used it to forge friendships that have become creative partnerships. Some of my best friends I've met through cannabis. My podcast co-host, Mike Glazer, and I met through cannabis, and now we write together. He's my writing partner, my creative partner, and he's also my podcast co-host. So it's really sort of worked its way in. It's sent roots into every part of my life, and there's no part that it hasn't touched, I think, at this point.
Interesting. I'm still at the stage where I am of the generation where I smell it or worried about somebody else smelling it and think, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I'm sitting on a beautiful array of different brands of CBD hemp, completely hemp cigarettes, which still smell like cannabis, but have zero THC. And I'm still going, oh my gosh, what if someone smells? So I have not incorporated it into my work. I do find that at night, if I use a THC tincture, I have a much better sleep. When you have much better sleep, you are much more energized during the day. I seem to be more creative and more productive, but I haven't ever used it while doing art. So I'm still trying to overcome decades, barriers, mental barriers. So that's kind of interesting. I think, and there's a lot of women who are the entire spectrum.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will say too, that one of my favorite things about it is, smoking a joint and listening to music, or going to a concert, or going to walk through a museum. Just the way you experience art by others when you're stoned is magical.
Well, it's an opening in a way. It's letting down some barriers. I think also when you're a type A control freak, that is a scary thing to not feel the control, or to be worried about what it'd be like if you didn't have the control. Because when you're in that state, it is so much more relaxing, so less stressful, and you're not even worried about it. It's just getting there.
Yeah, getting there and letting go.
Yeah, and letting go. Darylyn had a question, and I think this is a good wrap up as well. How do people get in touch with you, first of all? How do we find you? How do we get in touch with you? What's the best way to reach you?
I am on Instagram at thisismaryjane_. So you can just DM me on Instagram, or you can email me at maryjane@thisismaryjane.com. Or tweet at me. It's the same handle.
Is it This Is Mary Jane _ also on
Yes.
Twitter? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And, I love chatting with people. I love hearing from people about their own experiences. I love meeting new people. So yeah, please get in touch.
If somebody wants to be a guest on your show, how do they just get in touch with you that way as well? And what's the process for that?
The process for being on Weed Grub is to do really cool stuff that we want to talk about. So we've spoken to, I think, Allie Lou may be here actually with us. Allie is an incredible comedian here in Los Angeles, and we met her in Alaska at the Before You Die Festival and took note of her amazing comedy and her incredible singing. And we've had her on the podcast just to feature her. And, we had Alia Volts, who wrote this incredible book. And, if you're doing something really cool, please, DM me and let me know. We'd love to know more about you.
Excellent.
We have to have you on the podcast.
Does that mean me?
Yes. I can't wait to have you on the podcast.
Well, true story for those of you who didn't know. When I was on my book tour in LA, we were trying to get on the podcast, and it almost worked. And then something happened, and the schedule didn't pan out. So yeah, if I can actually get back to LA someday, I think that would be one of the highlights of my trip.
To have you. Yeah,
sure.
so much. I have so many questions to ask you.
Oh, good. Oh, can't wait. Well, this has been a great hour. I appreciate your time. I love what you're doing. I think your perspective is so important to hear. You have seen things from various sides in terms of what we're doing as women in this industry, the kinds of products that we're putting out, and how I love the way how you said we can design the chairs as we build the table. I love that so much. So thank you, Mary Jane Gibson, for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great time.
And for everyone who has been watching live, thank you so much for being here with us as well. You can find out more about these sessions every Wednesday and Sunday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at ellementa.com/events. That's ELLE, French for her, Menta, Spanish for mind, her mind, ellementa.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.